So Lily Freeman-Jones is a second-year PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. She's funded by a principal scholarship, and her work focuses on human and animal skin in early modern drama. She's supervised by Professor Warren Boutcher and by Evelyn Welch, who is the PI for the Wellcome-funded Renaissance Skin project at King's College London, which is awesome, and I'm obsessed with it, and you guys should all check it out. Her other research interests include sensory history, medical humanities, ecocriticism, medieval miscellanies, and contemporary poetry. But today, she's going to be talking us through Like to the Indians, from Mary Wroth's sonnet sequence Pamphilia to Amphilanthus, which is inset in the Urania. So with that, I would love to turn things over to Lily and let her tell us why we're doing skin, and then tell us about her particular take on it.
Thanks so much for that, Sophie. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here today with two scholars whose work I really admire, who've kindly agreed to help me put this panel together, just to give you guys a bit of a sense of the exciting work that's being done on women's writing on skin in the early modern period, basically. And of course, I'd like to really thank especially Sophie, without whom I would never even have heard of the online olios, and who helped me really lift this off the ground when I thought it might not be in the right ballpark at all for the Cavendish Society, and to Arnaud and E for doing such a great job of organising. So yeah, so broadly conceived, this panel was just designed to give you guys a sense of the variety and range that there is when we look at how early modern women are writing about skin. So skin, as some of you probably know, has become quite a hot topic in recent years, beginning with a host of books that were published in the early 2000s by Claudia Benthienne, Stephen Connor, and Carmen McKendrick, which looked at skin from a more history of ideas and philosophical perspective. And those were then followed by a huge upsurge of interest in skin across lots of different academic disciplines, particularly English and history. And that's only intensified as scholars look more and more at race in particular. And it's a really exciting time to be working on skin. And like Sophie said, in particular, this is kind of culminated with this huge Wellcome Trust £5 million project, with a whole team working on Renaissance skin that takes you from everything from parchment, pilgrim tattoos, and stigmata, to vegetable peelings, cheese rind, sausage skins, and tree bark. So yeah, at this moment where we're continuing to expand our understanding of skin's many meanings in the early modern period, I thought it seemed important to examine some more marginal voices, really, especially at a time where we're thinking about how we can best use the archives and amplify those voices that are often pushed out. Because women's voices and writing about skin are often kind of drowned out just because of they're so overwhelmed in comparison to the number of men writing about skin at this time. But yeah, I hope that these talks show that there are so many different ways to think about skin in the Renaissance, especially women writing about skin, and that women's writing can reveal really new, exciting insights into quite familiar contemporary concerns. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. Can you all see that okay? Gonna assume you can. Can't actually see you anymore now I've got rid of the Zoom, so hopefully it's fine. Great. So yeah, my talk is titled When Whiteness Fails, Wroth's Faulty Complexions. What does it mean for skin to fail? This paper begins with a simple idea that skin in early modern literature is most interesting to writers when it goes wrong. So in early modern times, as in our own, the body surface spoke its own language. But what appears most often in early modern literature is not how this communication works, but how it goes wrong. In this talk, I want to focus on how skin's faulty communications are presented in a single sonnet by Mary Wroth. In this poem, Wroth contrasts the white, untouched skin of her female speaker, Pamphilia, with the darkening skin of sun worshippers, to express Pamphilia's frustration at her isolation from her beloved, unlike those who can freely adore the sun god which they're worshipping in broad daylight. So Wroth's sonnet thus remodels the Petrarchan trope of the pale, inert female skin which she's inherited, endowing it with a new sensitivity, even in its state of want and deprivation. In doing so, she stages a striking intervention into a poetic discourse that overwhelmingly consists of male voices narrating and correcting the failures of white female skin to signify. Whiteness may have failed within the world of the poem, but the sonnet's textual surface allows the speaker to right the wrongs of the body's surface by rewriting her own version of events where her skin could not. Skin is often positioned as a kind of text in early modern literature, from its physical affinity with paper and parchment, to the similarity of how it's examined for marks of meaning from blushes to bruises. But if skin is a text, then it can be misread or be faulty itself. Of these tropes of skin as a faulty text, perhaps none is more popular than that of white women's skin, which is the type of skin I'm going to be focusing on today. This is what Othello means when he cries of Desdemona, "Was this fair paper, this most godly book, made to write whore upon?" Othello cannot reconcile Desdemona's skin, which he describes as whiter than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster, with the infidelities she's supposed to have committed. His description of her as fair paper positions her skin as meaningful in its very blankness, a meaning which has now become deceitful, illegible, and ironic, at least in his mind. Her actions have, he thinks, defaced that blankness with a new, troubling text, almost a kind of graffiti. Her whiteness has thus failed him. But this moment, and I hope this image on the screen as well, reveals how reading skin is often actually writing skin. So we see Othello at the moment before he murders Desdemona here. And you can see his eyes looking at her face, her skin, which obviously is often very close to the bed sheets, but his hand is kind of reaching towards her, and as I'm sure most of you know, he's about to suffocate her. So in imagining he sees whore written across Desdemona's skin, Othello is engaged in a process of active inscription, not of reading what is already there. The white surface of Desdemona's skin is eclipsed by the verbal surface that's overwritten it, one that's been co-authored by Iago and Othello together. These overwritings of white female skins are predominantly governed by male voices and hands across early modern literature. Yet this imbalance begins to be reversed as greater numbers of female writers appear over the 16th and 17th centuries. One particularly striking example is offered by Mary Wroth. Educated, talented, and from one of the most foremost literary families of her time, the Sidneys, Wroth was to compose two ambitious and groundbreaking works in her lifetime: the prose romance The Countess of Montgomery's Urania in 1621, and the sonnet sequence Pamphilia to Amphilanthus, written over a number of years before. The sonnet I'm focusing on today, F75, comes near the end of the manuscript version of Pamphilia, which is written from a steadfast and adoring female speaker, Pamphilia, to her erstwhile absentee lover, Amphilanthus. And the names actually mean Pamphilia means loving one and Amphilanthus means loving two. So it kind of sets up this imbalance between the two speakers that persists throughout the entire work. These poems were circulated amongst Wroth's friends throughout the 1610s in manuscript form, but then she updated them and actually included them within the Countess of Montgomery's Urania as a sequence themselves. So this image is of Wroth's own handwritten earlier version of Sonnet 75, but I've chosen to read out the printed version as it's the later text, and there's just, I think, 3 slight differences, mostly with turning a singular to a plural. So not major, but as Wroth's latest text, I thought it was best to go with that one. I just wanted to include this amazing image of her actual handwriting here, which is in this beautiful manuscript in the folder. So this is Sonnet 75. Like to the Indians scorched with the sun which they do as their God adore. So am I used by love. Forevermore I worship him, less favour have I won. Better are they who thus to blackness run, and so can only whiteness want deplore. Then I who pale white am with grief's store, nor can have hope but to see hopes undone. Besides, their sacrifices received in sight of their true saint, mine hid as worthless right. Grant me to see where I my offerings give, then let me wear the mark of Cupid's might in heart, as they in skin do Phoebus light, not ceasing offerings to love while I live. This is quite a complicated poem, so to better understand what Wroth is doing here, I just want to begin by tracing its larger movements and doing a bit of recap on it. So Wroth starts with quite a startling comparison. Just as the Indians who worship the sun are gradually darkened by it, so too does she receive less favour the more she venerates her own god love, which can be either Amphilanthus or the god of love himself, which is personified quite a lot throughout the sequence. The poem goes on to explain that while some worshippers, which the speaker calls Indians, more on that later, are able to venerate their god in broad daylight and proudly display the result in their skin, Pamphilia is left pale and wanting, forced to hide her adoration of her lover Amphilanthus. This extraordinary sonnet is often cited with reference to Wroth's participation in JONSON'S Masque of Blackness at court in 1605, where 12 female courtiers, including Wroth, appeared painted as blackamoors at Queen Anne's request. This was extremely sensational at the time, especially because black skin was often signified with cloth still at this time rather than paint. So denuding the women so that they could have so much exposed skin painted was quite risque already. McManus points to how blackness was unproblematic when associated with the body of the lower class male performer, but was subversive when assumed by the female aristocratic body. But while both Wroth's performance and this sonnet subvert the white female body with imagined darkness, it seems important to note that contrary to what a lot of critics have said, those darknesses are not the same. After all, as Brennan notes, Wroth's poem specifically refers to Indians rather than the Ethiopians of the Masque, which was set in West Africa and populated by the daughters of Niger. I'd like to posit instead that the emphasis on sun worship makes it far more likely Wroth is thinking of either the Incan sun god Inti from modern-day Peru, or the Hindu deity Surya. Wroth was well-read and well-connected, and clearly kept up with global affairs, such as through her long-standing correspondence with the well-travelled ambassador Dudley Carleton. Indeed, in 1617, Anne Clifford recorded in her diary, as you can see here, that she'd spent the evening with Lady Wroth, who told me a great deal of news from beyond the sea. Europeans were fascinated by the tales of sun worship that were returning from recent colonial voyages to South America, as depicted here in this hand-done drawing by Martin de Merua in his Historia General del Peru, 1616. Wroth may have been inspired by her own experience in the Masque, but the reference to blackness here clearly draws on a wider pool of knowledge which deserves its own recognition. In this sonnet, Wroth's equation of turning black with a kind of abuse is hardly surprising within the context of 17th century Britain, where blackness is synonymous with moral and aesthetic degradation. What is surprising, however, is the boldness of her next line, better are they who thus to blackness run. This extraordinary assertion relies on those prejudices for its power, but it's still an astonishing flight of imagination from them, even within the rhetorical confines of the poem. Wroth's justification for this statement ostensibly rests on the public nature of their worship of the Indians, as she calls them, but the choice of sun worship, which plays cleverly on the poetic commonplace of the beloved as a sun, gives a vivid warmth and tactility which simmers beneath the surface of the poem. The intense heat, even pain of scorch, mingles with the relish of adore here, evoking an experience of sensual abandon situated at the skin as well as the heart. This is only more tantalizing because of its contrast with the experience of the speaker of the poem, to whom such open displays of affection are off limits. Instead, she must remain pale and wan, a word fitting in its echo of wanting. For Pamphilia is wanting not only her lover, but, as the sonnet makes clear, adequate means to worship in person. Her white skin thus becomes a heavy burden, which makes the freely burnt skins of the others she describes only the more enviable within the poem's frame. Wroth's inclusion of sunburn is well judged. It allows her to blend rhetoric, race, and sensuality. And this is partly because of the position sunburn occupies in the early modern imagination. Hall observes it's not only a mark of racial difference in a time where environmental factors were competing alongside genetic as models of race, but also a mark of sensuality. The experience of sun on skin is often figured as an erotic contact. Sidney, Wroth's own uncle, writes of Stella that the sun which others burned did her but kiss. And Wroth herself echoes this when she writes of the goat herds in Urania. So white was their skin, as seen the sun in love with it, it would not hurt. Using sunburn to contrast the white female skin of Petrarchism takes us firmly inside that skin, where too often before we've been outside it, allowing it a rare sensitivity and tactility, even if that is expressed in absence rather than presence. Unable perhaps to go as far as being blackened herself, the final stanza tries to find a kind of resolution to that absence of surface marking by resolving to wear the mark of Cupid's heart, mark of Cupid's might in heart as they in skin do Phoebus's light. This delicately weighs two very different forms of effective encounter across internal and external surface, but the scales tip off balance. The first half lands heavily with mark and might connoting a weightiness that distends across the enjambment. By contrast, the succinct as they in skin do Phoebus's light benefits from the sense of completion as it fulfills the rhyme, but it also carries the ineffable, powerful lightness of wearing light in your very skin, a powerful and original early modern reimagining of what it might mean to be Black. But if the speaker ultimately seems to find her white skin unsatisfactory in its appearance and sensations, then perhaps there's a redemption of sorts to be found in that old analogy between paper and skin. Kim F. Hall has argued that the sun in this poem can stand for a male literary tradition, with the worshippers who the speaker envies figuring male Petrarchan poets who can take for granted their immersion in a literary tradition in a way that Wroth cannot. Keeping women white, she writes, as in unexposed to literary tradition, serves to keep the female subjugated without access to the copier necessary for invention. Hall's analysis is insightful, and her connection of the whiteness of skin with a blank slate of poetic invention particularly acute. But is the speaker in this poem fully subjugated? Even if, within the world of the poem, the display of love Pamphilia desires is barred from her, the very existence of the text testifies and in some way displays that love, even as it laments the stagnancy of its expression. Let me wear the mark of Cupid's might in heart, sighs Pamphilia, not ceasing offerings to love while I live. Love and living have become synonymous here, but both rest upon the act of making offerings. And those offerings ultimately can only be the words themselves, the poems that Pamphilia writes. Gavin Alexander, who's written extensively on Wroth and the Sidneys, muses that the taking on of voices in poetry, as Wroth does with Pamphilia, signifies ultimately that it's impossible to distinguish selfhood from the words we speak. And in that, perhaps the poem finds a way out. Pamphilia's white skin may be unmarked, but the white paper is no longer, and in doing so, it testifies to the experiences far more permanently than skin ever could. This is a sonnet that thinks deeply about skin's ability to testify, to mediate between inner and outer, but ultimately finds that ability wanting in favour of paper's own ability to do just that. So for Wroth, whiteness's failings are just the beginning of paper's possibilities. Thank you.